Shifting gears just a little bit, we're still on the topic of Ukraine. This was a story that has sort of taken, I wouldn't say the world by storm, but definitely conspiracy theory land by storm. And at least for those with inquisitive minds and are basically open to exploring and ask and are willing and intellectually honest enough to ask those questions. Glenn, your latest piece on Substack was covering the comments made by Victoria Nuland, who is the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs. She sat in front of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and she was asked a question by Senator Marco Rubio of Florida about whether Ukraine has bioresearch or biological weapons within Ukraine. And she gave a very puzzling answer. His exact question was, does Ukraine have chemical or biological weapons? And in your piece, you wrote that she basically said something completely uncharacteristic, is that she told the truth for like a minute before Marco Rubio cut her off to try to make sure that if any chemical or biological weapons attack ever occurred, it was 100% going to be the fault of Russians. Now, having basically been asking a lot of questions about this, what have you really learned since that initial exchange? And what can we really, I mean, the disinformation machine is very strong. And how are we so sure that these are similar bioresearch labs like the Wuhan Institute of Virology in China, or something with maybe far more dangerous and lethal pathogens that are used for probably more nefarious purposes?
Yeah, it's a really interesting and important topic. You know, the Russians and the Chinese have been accusing the United States for weeks, if not longer, but weeks in connection with this conflict, of maintaining and cultivating in partnership with the Ukrainians a sophisticated and dangerous biological and chemical weapons program right on the other side of the border with Russia. And the Russians claim that they discovered documents that corroborate this. The Chinese say that their satellite and intelligence apparatus have proven that it's true. I never mention it because I don't trust the assertions of the Chinese and Russian government. I don't take it as true unless there's evidence presented. I wish
Right.
people treated the pronouncements of the US government in a similar way. But the reason Marco Rubio asked Victoria Nuland that question was because he was aware that this was circulating in the air, and he wanted her, he obviously expected her to say, no, Senator, of course Ukraine doesn't have biological and chemical weapons. Those are barred. And as a way of debunking the conspiracy, that's obviously what he was expecting her to say. And in retrospect, of course, it's what you would expect her to say, given that she's a lifelong neoconservative liar. I mean, she started off as, as Dick Cheney's national security advisor, was the NATO ambassador under George Bush, and then ran Ukraine policy for Hillary Clinton because Hillary Clinton adores Victoria Nuland because she's a neocon like Hillary Clinton, and now she runs Ukraine for Joe Biden as well. And so she's just kind of a revealing figure unto herself, but she typically knows how the propaganda game is played. And for some reason, she didn't just say, no, of course, Senator, Ukraine doesn't have biological and chemical weapons. She instead said, in a very kind of halting, careful, nervous tone, she said, Ukraine has biological research facilities. And the most important part is, and obviously that's a vague phrase in terms of what it means, but she gave a lot of information about how we should think about that when she quickly added, we're very concerned, she said, that these materials are going to fall into Russian hands. And we are working tirelessly with the Ukrainians to secure them and make certain that doesn't happen. And the reason that addendum was so important is because you might be tempted to try and say, oh, well, they're just kind of like high school fun labs with like some Bunsen burgers and flasks. Like they mix, like water and vinegar and they watch like the little explosion happen. It's like very benign. But obviously, if it were this like benign lab like that, or something that was just about finding like a cure for multiple sclerosis or something, she wouldn't be gravely worried that they would fall into the hands of the Russians. You'd only be gravely worried if these were sophisticated and potentially dangerous materials in these labs. So that's why, and then Marco Rubio did interrupt her and said, but like, nonetheless, despite what you just shocked me by saying, you would agree with me, right? That if there is a chemical or biological weapons attack in Ukraine, it's 100% definite that would be Russia, not Ukraine. And she, of course, then realized, what she had done. And she said, yeah, of course, it was 100% obviously clear that it's only Russia.
100%.
So, but the problem is, it didn't take that back. I watched it live on C-SPAN. I saw it, and it doesn't go away. So the question then becomes posed to the United States government, because obviously Russia and China seized on that, was, well, what does that mean? And so the US government came out using all its organs, the Pentagon, the White House, people who take orders from the Pentagon, like Jennifer Griffin on Fox News, and every other Pentagon correspondent who works on the networks. And they all came forward and said, they just issued this emphatic absolute denial. They said, the United States government does not have any biological or chemical weapons in Ukraine or anywhere else for that matter, because they're barred by convention. Now, let me just tell you why that's so interesting. Obviously, we just got done talking about the 9/11 attacks. In my opinion, more significant than the 9/11 attacks were the attacks that occurred 2 or 3 weeks after the 9/11 attacks, which were the anthrax attacks, when this extremely weaponized strain of anthrax, this very sophisticated weaponized strain manipulated in the lab, not occurring in nature, was sent through the mailbox to a variety of prominent people, and it ended up killing 5 people and injuring, I think, about a half dozen more. And the reason that was so terrifying was because, unlike 9/11, which targeted power centers in New York and Washington, this was something going to the suburbs, like appearing in people's mailboxes. And it was terrifying, like this anthrax strain that's like a biological weapon that has now been unleashed on American soil 3 weeks after the 9/11 attack. And ultimately, there was about a week, people have forgotten, where they leaked to ABC News and to other media outlets that tests on the anthrax discovered that it had the characteristic markings of an Iraqi biological weapons program, that it had the presence of this substance called bentonite, which is basically nothing more than like the substance that holds together cat litter. And the argument was only Saddam uses bentonite in his anthrax, so it probably came from him. They, kind of swept that aside after about a week, but it did its job. I mean, it was on David Letterman. It was John McCain talked about it all over the place. But then the FBI purported to solve the case in 2008 by claiming that they were about to arrest an Army research scientist who worked at the infectious disease lab in Fort Detrick, Maryland, which happens to be under the control and command of Dr. Fauci. And right before they could arrest him, he killed himself. But the FBI story was he is the anthrax attacker. And what he did was he had obviously developed extremely sophisticated weaponized forms of anthrax that he unleashed on the public. So how is it that we know that? We know that according to the FBI, biological weapons, namely this sophisticated anthrax, came from a U.S. Army lab. And yet the U.S. government can stand up with a straight face and say, we don't ever develop biological weapons. There's a convention that bars that. The answer is that they just play this semantic game where they say the treaty bars offensive research into offensive weapons, meaning you can't do research in order to develop biological weapons that you intend to unleash on humanity. What you can do, though, is defensive research, meaning you can create the weapons as long as it's for the intention only of studying it to develop vaccines. But it's the same exact thing. Like, it doesn't, if your goal were to develop weaponized anthrax, you would do exactly what the US government was doing, namely creating these AIM strains, this very sophisticated, lethal strain of anthrax. So this is the same thing that we saw last year when the questions about the Wuhan Institute of Virology emerged, which is we know for sure that institute was manipulating coronaviruses that develop in nature to make them much more contagious and much more lethal. When you do that, you're creating a biological weapon. Now, of course, their argument is, yeah, but we're not doing it to unleash onto the public. We're doing it, again, just to study it, to determine how we can develop vaccines. But it's the same thing. If you were going to try and turn the coronavirus into a biological weapon, you would do exactly what the Institute of Virology in Wuhan did. And we see, even whether it was a lab leak or it was zoonotic, the potential for a pathogen like that to cause enormous amounts of sickness and death. And so this whole denial that the United States government has issued over the last 24 hours it's a joke. It's just a semantic mirage. And I still want to know, what is it about those biological research facilities that Victoria Nuland shockingly acknowledged existed in Ukraine that makes them so dangerous that she's that worried that they're going to fall into the hands of the Russians.
Before I hand it off to Jay, I believe it's because they're worried that in Ukraine, they found the cure to cancer and they don't want Russians to take credit for it.
Exactly. It's a very important thing.
Exactly what it is.
That's got to be
Yeah,
it.
no, it's an important thing to make sure that Russian children die of pediatric cancer. You don't want them getting their hands on a cure.
Yes. All right, Jay.
In my view, I think they figured out a way to healthily eat ass after you get off the treadmill. But what's really funny about this denial is there's a track record of the American army and government using these either pathogens or chemical weapons on either its own people, on other nations. So it really questions what is really going on. And the fact that there's nobody else, I haven't seen a report on it. I haven't seen a New York Times article on it. I haven't seen a Washington Post article on it. CNN hasn't had anybody come on to talk about these issues because it is worrisome. What if what they're working on could be 1,000 times more potent than coronavirus, and we have no idea?
Well, first of all, let me just say, like, there was an article on September 4th, 2001, so exactly a week before the September 11th attacks, in the New York Times by Judy Miller, who ended up being discredited for her gullible reporting on Iraqi WMD, but she, at that point, up until that point, was considered to be one of the most important journalists working in the field of biological and chemical weapons development. And this article, which obviously, because it was written a week before 9/11, got completely forgotten due to historical events, but she reported that the United States government was actively developing all kinds of programs under the aegis of the CIA to make anthrax and other pathogens much more lethal, in a way that even ethics experts and diplomats inside the US government were starting to be very concerned violated treaty obligations because there was no way to claim that that was defensive research. Beyond that, what we know for sure is that in Ukraine, there have been programs in the past that involved the development of anthrax and other biological weapons. The claim is that there was kind of like a residue from the former Soviet Union. The Soviet Union had put anthrax and other biological labs, weapons labs in Ukraine and Kazakhstan and other countries that are former Soviet republics. And so we know for sure that there was, at least at some point, an active anthrax program in Ukraine. We have pictures of President Obama, then Senator Obama, with people who worked in the Pentagon on securing these materials in Ukraine, looking at anthrax labs. So again, when Victoria Nuland says these are really dangerous biological research facilities, you have to be a complete idiot, just an imbecile, to think that the conclusory denials from the Pentagon or the White House resolve that problem. The problem is it's taboo to talk about it because it sounds as if you're justifying the Russian invasion, or that you're, agreeing with claims of Russia and China. And the issue is that 2 weeks ago, when these claims started to emerge from China and Russia, many, many media outlets went and quote unquote debunked it under the guise of fact checking. They claimed that it was clearly a false conspiracy theory, that it was being circulated by QAnon, just like they purported to debunk all kinds of false conspiracy theories during COVID that we now know are at least viable, if not true, including the lab leak, which they very early on said only liars and conspiracy theorists would suggest this came from a lab. We know for sure it was zoonotic, and then the Biden administration a year later admitted they have no idea and are actually investigating what the real origins are of the COVID pandemic. So many things like that, where fact checking is just a way of disseminating propaganda and making it seem more high-minded. So now they're all closing ranks. They can't admit they all labeled this a conspiracy theory and now have to be open to it. So they're just doing the bidding of the government in order to protect themselves.
Yeah, it's a lot of it just seems incredibly, I don't know. It's shady. It's really shady, especially given the fact that 2 years ago, any suggestion that the coronavirus leaked from a lab was considered anti-Asian xenophobia or discrimination. It was considered conspiracy theory of the highest order. And why
Right.
would the United States be involved in gain of function research? At this point, why are we even calling it gain of function? It's, as you said, weaponization of these lethal viruses and pathogens, making them more deadly. And while, maybe the United States government and the public health sector is trying to look at how to make these viruses and pathogens more deadly to study them, at the end of the day, there seems to be very little net benefit for society, especially when people like this U.S. Army researcher with the anthrax attack takes matters into their own hands or goes rogue and basically tries to kill a bunch of people. I mean, we could have easily had so many more pandemics than we probably have had.
First of all, it's just, this whole thing about like that allusion you made to the attempt to call people who are open to the lab leak racist was always so bizarre to me, because the theory they were insisting upon as the proven truth was that the Chinese have such unsanitary eating habits. They go to these filthy, disgusting, disease-ridden wet markets and like swallow bats right there, and that's what causes diseases. I don't know. It kind of sounds a lot more racist to me than, hey, there's this really sophisticated lab that they're working in partnership with the United States to develop vaccines. And as happens sometimes in labs, there was an accident and there was a leak from the lab. I don't know. The first version sounds way more racist to me than the second, but it just shows how this racist accusation is always deployed against anybody who's saying something that you want to discredit.
Right.
That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, that's the problem, right? Is when you do all this behind closed doors. And I think this is, definitely what happened in terms of why the scientific community closed ranks so quickly after first, behind the scenes being not just open, but leaning toward a lab leak. Why they closed ranks behind Dr. Fauci and British health officials is because they knew that if the lab leak was deemed viable or possible or probable, it would bring a lot of public attention into what the scientific community does. And they don't want that attention. They want to be able to do whatever they want to do without the broader society raising ethical questions about whether these experiments are worth it. Scientists just want to discover things for its own sake, which maybe is not a bad impulse, but it's an impulse that needs to be checked, because oftentimes the dangers of finding things out scientifically outweigh greatly the benefits of finding them out. But they, I think, tried to discredit that theory because they knew it would subject their work to public scrutiny in a way that they didn't want. And I think the same is true here. The idea that the United States engages in biological weapons research, which it absolutely does, is something that will bring attention onto what scientists are doing. And again, they want to just attack as crazy or, as Kremlin agents, anybody who suggests that that's what's happening.
They try to paint everybody as being Alex Jonesy when they question these things. And it's really funny because when we're having these discussions, it does sound kind of conspiracy theory, because that's kind of what they are until we get proven facts. But the more we talk about it, the more it sounds like the truth that is out there compared to what the national narrative that they're trying to put on people. So the narrative that they try to push sounds more wacky than what we're actually trying to question and discuss, especially when it comes to the coronavirus. Fauci came on nonstop talking about the different ways we need to mandate over this coronavirus. You need to listen to your government and do what it says. All of these certain things that restrict your life over this, and he's nowhere to be seen right now. I haven't seen Fauci on TV at all as we're lifting mandates. And wouldn't you want him, the guy who was saying you have to be so scared of all of this stuff, we have to lock down everything, mask kids, all this stuff, to be the face to say everything is okay right now? Where is he? Why?
Yeah,
why?
this thing with conspiracy theories, it's so interesting. It's like the people who call others conspiracy theorists who raise possibilities that the mainstream has pronounced are false are the same people who flooded American political discourse with the most insane, unhinged conspiracy theory I ever heard, which is that Vladimir Putin had essentially infiltrated the halls of American power and taken over control of the US government through sexual, personal, and financial blackmail over the sitting president of the United States. Like, completely batshit crazy,
Right.
like, conspiracy that would come right from the film that they insisted was true. And they like would use body language experts and, you know, the way Trump like stood in Helsinki and every other kind of like insane, you know, Redditor investigator. Yeah, to justify it. And then they like impaneled this 18-month investigation only for Robert Mueller to close his investigation, indicting nobody for criminal conspiracy and concluding that he never found any evidence to establish these crazy conspiracy theories. Because nobody are worse conspiracy theorists than them. That's the first thing. And the second is conspiracy theory, conspiracies exist. There are people in American prison right this moment who have been convicted of conspiracies. Conspiracies are nothing more than a group of people working toward a same goal in secret. And they do that all the time. They work together toward a common goal together in secret because they don't want anyone to know what it is they're doing. That's very common in human activity. And, you know, here I'm in Brazil, as you guys know, I live here in Brazil. When there was a coup in 1964 against the democratically elected government, a lot of Brazilian leftists said they believed the CIA and the United States were responsible, that they engineered it, they financed it. The United States vehemently denied it. And anybody who's claimed it was, of course, branded a crazy conspiracy theorist. 5 years later, in 1969, documents began being declassified and emerging, showing that the CIA played a central role in the coup. And now, you know, 40 years later, or 50 years later, it's established fact that that's what happened. So oftentimes conspiracy theorists end up being vindicated, but it's supposed to be a term that once it gets applied to you, it's supposed to be so inherently derogatory that everyone should stop listening to you.
Right.
Yeah.
Just like racist and bigot and everything. There's a meme out there with Alex Jones, and it's basically saying this is where you are in life. And it's all the conspiracy theories that turned out to be true that he's talking about in his on his show.
Yeah.
By the way, 69. I just had to say nice to that because that was quite a nice
I would be
year.
really disappointed if I came on your show and that didn't come
That
up.
didn't happen.
I just didn't want to interrupt your answer, Glenn. I'm trying to be a respectful host. Unlike when Jay says anything, he just or I say anything and Jay interrupts me immediately.
Yeah,
we have
not knowing the show of the host or the book names or very professional.
Exactly. Thank you, Jay.